This is the Revive Podcast, and I am your host, Freddie Romero. And today we are excited to have a very special dear friend. But before we do that, we want to just thank you for being here. This is the podcast that aims to inspire, inform, and resource you so that you can live out your redemptive purpose in your circles of influence. And make sure you subscribe to this and you share this episode and get ready to take a ton of notes. Today on this special episode, we have Steve Chaparro. Now, I gotta read this because this is important. He is the founder and principal at Culture Design Studio, an organizational design agency based in Long Beach, California. Steve is an organizational culture expert and communicator who speaks worldwide about how companies can transform their workplace through co-creation and communication. He is a multi-business owner. He is passionate. He has a passionate message of navigating the transformative journey of leadership. And this resonates with visionaries. Guys, there's a reason why he's on this episode today. And this message resonates with visionaries and innovators who find themselves stuck in the messy in-between seasons. Can you relate to that? He is currently writing his book with the working title, The Architect of Transformation. He's a graduate of the USC School of Architecture and Parsons School of Design at the New School. And if you want to up your leadership capacity, you need to go to stevechaparro.co and you need to take his free 5-day audio course for visionary leaders. Guys, help me welcome Steve Chaparro to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Freddie, I am ready for Freddie. Let's do this.
Let's do this. Steve, you have... I love, and this is just part of who you are. This doesn't even give the world. And for our family and for our church, you are a blessing. You are a friend. You are a leader here at Revive. And so please, for those who don't know you, give us some context beyond this that we just shared. Give us some context about who you are.
Yeah, but there's so much that is not there because, I go back, and I'm not going to go back to where I was born or the hospital, but I will say this, that I'm a PK. So my dad was a pastor for many years. My grandfather on my mother's side was a pastor. All my uncles on my mom's side were pastors. I have a great-grandfather, great-uncles, great-great-grandfathers that were bishops and pastors. So the heart of a pastor, the heart of a teacher, the heart of a communicator has always been there. And so I grew up with that, and I grew up knowing that that was going to be part of what I was going to do for the rest of my life. So coming into college, I went to study architecture, but when I did graduate from architecture school, I had this big question that many of us have that are in ministry is, God, are you calling me to the marketplace? Or are you calling me to ministry? And the Lord said, yes, I'm calling you to both. So I took this path of not only being in ministry for many years, bivocationally, serving as a membership pastor, of evangelism pastor, and all these different things, but all the while kind of going through my professional journey through different industries. This is what brings me to today. It's been a journey of self-discovery. And it's been one filled with frustration, and also success, but also a lot of those valleys. And I've learned more in the valleys than I have at the mountain peaks.
I do definitely want to talk about that because for a lot of people globally, these last 18 months, 2 years, have felt like a very dark valley.
For sure.
So I want to park that right now for a sec. But can you explain... professionally, what is it that you help companies do? Because I think it's important because it lends itself. There's a reason why we wanted to have a certain conversation with you today. And I think it's important for people to get that because, man, that sounds so cool. And I kind of have an idea.
Yeah.
But not necessarily, I know.
Well, I think I need to actually explain what led me to this first, because I was at a national architecture firm, and I was VP of strategic design. And what we did there was we helped clients tell their organizational narrative in their space. So we called it spatial storytelling. And so as part of that process, we would undergo this discovery process where we would ask a lot of questions of these organizations to really understand who they were, what were their values, how did they tell that story, what was their story. And so many times we found out that many of these organizations actually did not know what their story was. But what they did know is that they were in dysfunction. And so I started to realize that the work that we did on the design side, those same principles of design thinking, empathy, storytelling, could actually be applied to the work of the organization themselves. So rather than designing buildings, what I wanted to do was actually help these organizations redesign or to transform themselves.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to help organizations do that. So I made a pivot. So in a sense, it's like rather than being an architect of buildings, I wanted to be an architect of organizations.
Right. So you were more focused on what was inside of these buildings than the actual building themselves.
Yeah, because many times a lot of these organizations thought that their problem was their space.
Huh.
But rather than the space being their problem, it was their story.
Yeah.
So I wanted to help fix the story.
Why do you think it's so easy for churches, businesses, organizations to focus on the space factor first, their building factor first, instead of their story?
Well, I think the space is just one sort of manifestation of what they believe is like the real problem. It may be space for business, it might be product. For a church, it might be programs, right? All of these different things that we feel that our customers will be saved, the people in our community will be saved by this one programmatic element.
Right.
Again, program could be in the form of product, space,
Service.
program, whatever. Okay,
Yeah.
all these different things.
Yeah.
And we start to think and we rely and almost treat those, spiritually speaking, as idols. As we think that the mechanism, the tool, the utility is the thing that will save them rather than sort of the spiritual, the relational, the people, the spiritual side of things.
Yeah.
And so we almost end up using these things, products, programs, spaces, as crutches. And when they don't work, we get, there's a lot of dysfunction and even frustration that happens.
At what point does an organization or the leadership of an organization say, hey, we need to work on our story? Or was it a thing that when they would hit up your firm or when they would contact you and you'd come, they had no idea that it was their story and the way they were communicating their story, the issue? Like, was there an assessment period, or did they know at what point did someone realize, like, I got a story issue?
Well, I think sometimes it's not always they don't always first know that. In fact, they come to you for a different reason. So they may come to you and say, Steve, we need you guys to redesign our space. Or in other cases, they may say, we need you guys to redesign our marketing process. Or we need you to redesign the way we do campaigns with our marketing organization. And then when we dig into it, we realize that that's not the real problem, that there's something deeper. There's something deeper that needs to happen. So generally, if they're willing to go deeper and do the real work, we can start to talk about what cultural challenges might be, how to redesign their organization, how to help leaders show up differently.
Yeah.
But it's not until you actually get into it. So generally, people don't come to you, oh, we need you to help to solve our cultural problems.
Right.
There's not a line item in their budget for cultural consultants.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the lack of awareness, and I think, you could even take this to a personal level. A lot of times we think that the issues and circumstances that we're going through are just external happenstance that we're living through, rather than look internally and look at the culture that we're setting in our personal space or mentally. So when you would bring this up and you would highlight this and say, hey, you don't have a design problem, you don't have a product problem, you don't have a service or a marketing problem, you have a culture problem, what would be the apprehension from those? What would be the pushback from those that didn't want a journey?
Yeah.
And didn't have they didn't want to create a line item for culture in their budget? What was usually their apprehension? What was their pushback?
Well, in some cases, they did have a spatial problem, or they did have a product or a process problem. So we could say, okay, we've identified that there's a deeper issue here at hand. So we have at least two ways of going. One, we could solve the problem you think you have, and which is product, program, space, all these other things, but we don't think it's going to solve your real problem. So we can do that, or we can actually get into the real work, the real problem
Yeah.
at hand.
Yeah.
There's been people that don't, when there is pushback, and they say, "Hey, I just hired you to do this, or I want you to do this." And we don't want to solve it. Like, it's messy. It's going to cost us money. It's going to
Mhm.
cost us headache. I don't want to do that. That's stuff for like 5 years out. Like, we need you to help us solve a problem in the
Now.
next 10 weeks. And so it's at that point that you have different ways of responding. You can say, okay, we can fill your order,
Yeah.
like a waitress or a
Yeah.
waiter, and say, okay, we're just going to give you what you asked for. We can do that. Or we can look at some of these other things, because I really feel very passionate about helping people solve the problems that they need to solve, not necessarily solving the problems they want to solve. Because how many of us really want to solve the deep, sort of messy work? No one wants to do
No.
that.
No.
And so in some cases, we end up doing some of the easy work, in some cases, but in other cases, we start to gauge the leader's appetite for true transformation. And if
Right.
we see that it's not there, as a consultant, you have an option. You can say, what, I'm gonna pass.
Yeah.
And there was a case at the architecture firm where we had a potential client was going to hire us for a $7 million project to solve the thing that they wanted to solve, which was a building. But when we knew that there were other issues there to solve, we said, you know what? We don't think that you're willing to solve the real problem. We don't think this is going to work out. So we're going to kindly actually walk away. So we walked away from a $7 million project because there was not going to be success. We just
Yeah.
knew it.
Yeah. Yeah. So we think about it in our context, right? We're on the Revive podcast, and this is a church community. These past 2 years globally for the Big C church, right? The global church was an opportunity to pivot. What are some of the things that you think the pandemic exposed as to how we were designing and building the church? What do you think? Because I think we could all agree that regardless of nation, there must be a culture problem, because there was a study that came out where they surveyed over 100 communities that surrounded churches, and they asked those communities if they felt the impact of the church being closed during the months that it was mandated to be closed. And 79% of those communities said they felt no impact at all with the churches closing their doors. But if you would have asked the congregation if they felt impacted by the church having its doors closed, 96% said yes, they felt a personal impact. So the community doesn't feel it, the congregation feels it, which lets you know that the service and the focus was inward, not outward.
Yeah.
So what do you think are some of the things that these past 2 years exposed, the current events exposed in the church?
Well, I mean, let's break it down to those two groups that you talked about. One, the community. I think one, it exposed whether or not the community is being impacted. I've always asked the question, and there's a lot of even books out there like um, the I think it's the Inward Focused Church, or the that asked the question, if your church ceased to exist, would the community miss you?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
maybe COVID has in some cases answered that question for us, and they're saying,
Wow.
you know what, they didn't miss a beat because we weren't making an impact. Now, if we did make an impact, that would also expose that. It would reveal that. There's a lot of things that says from a very personal perspective that hardship doesn't change you, it exposes you,
Hmm.
right? It exposes who you are. It exposes whether or not you're having impact. It also exposes whether or not you're discipling. So
Right.
to speak to the other one, the church, if there is this codependency that I think sometimes we've created within the Big C church,
Right.
between churches and our church community, is that there is a codependency. Because in some cases we would say, a pastor might say, I want people to need me.
Mm.
I want people to have to come to church and
Yeah.
say, the sermon was good, the music was awesome. I needed this. There's a part of us, let's be honest, there's an egotistical side of us that loves being needed,
Right.
that loves being wanted, that loves being praised. And so when we didn't have that, and we hear, oh, the church really, really wanted us and misses us, they can't do without us. There's a part of us that actually says,
Yeah.
I see how much I'm needed. Like, but then in some cases, even as we're going through this whole time of COVID, I think the whole issue of discipleship, and I know that's something that we're talking about here at Revive Church really heavily, is this: how can discipleship happen where it doesn't require people to come into the church,
Right.
but that discipleship can happen in the life groups, and we're raising the tide.
Yeah.
What we're doing is we're raising the tide for everybody to step into what I think is the most basic and the essence of what discipleship is.
Let me ask you almost a softball question that might set me up for the next question. As an architect, could you look at another architect's blueprints or design and say, based on what the blueprints or the design, I can kind of gauge what he was thinking through when he was designing this?
I in some cases, I mean, I think if an architect, the way we were taught in school was that you have to do everything for a reason. If you're just doing things, just to look good, if you're splashing color, if you're splashing weird spaces, but you're
Yeah.
not doing it for a reason, that might get these sort of the unsophisticated person all like, in all of it. But for those that are in the know, like they will probably question it.
Yeah.
So I think when you see something that is done with intention, that there is a purpose even behind the beauty, that it's not just a beautiful piece, there is an actual utility for it. There's a function to it. And the simplicity of it. And so whether or not you're like minimalism or modernism or
Yeah.
Gothic, whatever, that there's a purpose behind it. So I don't know that I can necessarily say I can see what the journey looked like, because that's going to be an evolutionary process that I don't think I could discern, but I could almost look at a set of plans or a space and say, where he arrived, I can see why he made decisions, or he or she made decisions
Yeah.
in that way.
Yeah. Okay. So we believe that Jesus will build his church. We believe that he's coming back for his bride, right? We believe that he knows he's the author and finisher of our faith. So, based on what you read in scripture, what was Jesus' intent when he designed the church? What do you think God was creating when he created this body to be movement? Paul describes the church and he describes the people in the church as parts of the body. When you read scripture, what do you think God's intent and purpose was for the church?
So I think that purpose is not something that we will ever truly understand in any sort of snapshot in time. We will have a sense of it as we go through it, and that sense, that snapshot will kind of evolve as we experience it. I almost think of it as, what are those puzzles with the pieces that there's a picture on it, but you have to move it around in order to create that picture. And so you move one piece, it's almost like a Rubik's Cube,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
The
yeah.
intention is that they're all, same colors on each side, but you have to be able to think like a chess player.
Several
20
moves ahead.
20 moves ahead. And I think that there's a little bit of humor, I believe, that God has in his design, in that we see the church, like if it's a all mixed up Rubik's Cube, we look at that and we say, oh, if that's the church, it's jacked up. Okay, like no. Okay, there is a design for it. Just keep going, keep experiencing, keep giving yourself into it. And as you give yourself into it, you're going to get different ideas and different perspectives of what this is going to look like. So it's almost like you're going to have a different vantage point at each season that you experience. And so when people say they look at the church 2020, 2022, let's even go back, 2000, there is almost like we see things from that perspective, and we're going to say this doesn't work.
Yeah.
And I said, no. It's like when people come to Jesus with questions, and he knows the intent behind their question.
Yeah.
So he asks them a question, knowing that it's going to take them to a different place. So that was kind of a convoluted answer, but I almost think that God almost puts what we believe to be inherent dysfunctions in the church so that it will cause us to explore and keep going into it so that we discover new things about his design. So his design is not static. His design is dynamic. And so you can never just say, I have this impression of what the church is. It will always be this for the next 200 years.
Yeah. What are some of those dysfunctions, maybe like an example of one of those dysfunctions that you think lends itself to revealing a little bit of what God intended with the church?
Well, I think the whole idea that sometimes when we think of even the fivefold ministry, right, in the book of Galatians, and we sometimes think that our pastors should have all five of those giftings. Well, we call a pastor for a reason because they're probably gifted in shepherding. Does that mean that they're absolutely gifted in all these other areas? Possibly, possibly not.
Yeah.
And so there's no one pastor that is fully loaded, that has all the giftings. And so that might be one particular area in terms of leadership, because we all have personalities, we all have styles, we all have dysfunctions. And so if we think that the leader of my church has faults, that must mean that the church has faults. Absolutely it does. So I think that there are all these different examples where that can play out.
Yeah. Now that you touched on the fivefold ministries, we, just as an acronym, we always call it APEST, right? It's apostles, pastors, evangelists, shepherds. No, wait,
Teachers, yeah. No, so prophetic. So that was apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers.
I remember that when we were in life group together, when we first came to Revive, you shared how there are different expressions. A lot of times we think that, we think that these gifts are only given to clergymen, to the clergy. We think like, just those that are in vocational ministry have one of these gifts, or like you said, all of these gifts. But then number two, one of the things that you also highlighted to me was that there are expressions of this. I don't want to use the word real world, but just for the sake of this conversation, and outside of ministry, like vocational ministry, outside of the church, the four walls of the church, can you describe some of the thought process? I know that Ellen Hirsch wrote something alongside of this, but I remember you explaining it, and I think it would be very good for our listeners and those that are part of our church to just be able to articulate this a little bit better, because in Ephesians, I think this is where Paul is talking about what God has given to some. He gave this and this and the other. So, can you just share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, obviously the scripture talks, as you said, is the fivefold ministry, but it also says that these are given for the equipping, the building up of the church for the work of the ministry. Okay. So these five functions are meant to build up the church, to equip them so that they can do the ministry. Well, I grew up in a context where if you were going to embrace the highest calling, it was going to be that of a pastor. Like there was no higher calling. Like that was the most revered. And I don't disrespect that.
Yeah.
But what that did kind of ruffled my feathers a bit was that in a sense, it diminished everyone else.
Yeah.
And when I was in this whole context of after college, do I go to the workplace or do I go to the ministry? Is it marketplace or ministry? And God said, yes. And it was both. So I began to, start to think about, why is it that the apostolic gifting, the prophetic, the evangelistic, the teachers and the shepherds, why does that only exist, at least in my context, within formal ministry? And I began to, start to read books that exposed me to people who were called out into the marketplace, whether they were on Broadway, whether they were in TV, whether they were in the business corporate room. They were called, and I started to recognize in them, as Alan Hirsch writes, elements of the APEST model, where there were these apostolic folks are those who are pioneers.
Okay. Apostolic people are those that are pioneers. Okay.
Are pioneers. They're going to start something. They're going to cross borders. These are people who they're visionaries. They are going to start something from nothing. These are the entrepreneurs. And so if you see a church planter is definitely going to be someone who's apostolic. Okay. Oh, isn't an entrepreneur a business planter?
Yeah.
A business starter?
Yeah.
They're starting something from nothing. And it takes a certain personality. Like even when they go through church planter assessments, they want to see that you can start something from nothing.
Right,
Okay.
right.
So I started to see that there were expressions, and I started to feel this burden to legitimize the giftings in people who chose to express their calling outside of formal ministry. And so the apostolic was those that were starters, the entrepreneurs. The prophetics were those who were like the strategists, who can see problems and identify solutions and even call out truth to power. Like a lot of artists have prophetic voices. The evangelists are very much those people who can recruit people. They're galvanizers. They can recruit people to a call. So a lot of salespeople are evangelists.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then you think of shepherds. These are team leaders. These are people who are able to bring about teams and help teams grow. And then there's the teachers who can actually instruct people. And so I think the pushback that I've gotten about this way of thinking is, Steve, but read that second half of the verse. This is all for the equipping of the saints to do the work of the ministry.
Right.
But for me, the church goes beyond just the four walls of the church, and being able to treat our workplaces, treat the stages of Broadway, the sets of Hollywood, the boardrooms in the financial square.
Yeah.
Like these are our mission fields themselves. And I thought that I was necessarily called to those places, but I began to realize that I was called to not only legitimize, but to equip those people who have been called to those spaces.
There's probably someone listening to this right now, and they're like, okay, I can see it, but I don't see it for myself. Do one of these, fivefold ministries, do one of these gifts, like, is this something that is given to everyone? Is this for a selected few? What is the disbursement, right, of these gifts?
I don't know if I don't know the answer to that. And I know that, Alan Hirsch and his APAS model, and I know Will Mancini wrote a book with him as well that talks about this, because I think Alan Hirsch initially wrote a book that I think explored what APAS looks like in the ministry. Okay. And then he wrote a second book about, I think 4 or 5 years ago, of how it actually looks out in the the workplace. I know Dave Gibbons has talked about this a lot, pastor at New Song, because he is an advisor to a lot of these folks who are venture capitalists, who are filmmakers, who are inventors. And so he definitely is in that space a lot right now. But to answer your question, I don't know what the disbursement is. There may be stats that come out of the APES model, but I know that there are some alignings. Like here at Revive Church, when we take people through the growth track, we have them do the DISC model, and then we have them do the spiritual gifts. So one is like personality, and the other one is spiritual gifting. I tend to believe, and there's probably an assessment out there that, like say for instance, the DISC model, they say that only about 3% of people in the world are Ds. Okay.
Yeah.
That aligns very much even when you look at the innovation curve, the innovation adoption curve. It's like a bell curve.
Yeah.
So when there's a new idea, how many people adopt that idea as it kind of goes through its life cycle? Or they say that the first 3%, 2.5% are the innovators. And then the next 12.5% are the early adopters, and then so on and so forth. So I believe that the innovators are very much like the Ds. 2.5% are the innovators, 3% are the Ds. For me, there's some connection there.
Yeah.
So I almost feel like, say, the apostolic gifting, the innovators, the prototypers are probably my guess, I've got zero stats around this,
Yes.
but I almost feel like there's some universal connection between all of these things,
Yeah.
the DISC profile, innovation adoption curve, APEST. So my guess, this is just totally my guess, is that about 3% of people have this apostolic gifting.
Got it.
And then you can, you know,
Yeah.
but this is, I'd love to actually have a study done.
That would be really, really cool. So I think, a question then would be, how essential do you think is it for someone to be self-aware?
Oh, extremely. I feel like, so you mentioned the book, okay? And the premise of that book is that nothing will be unlocked in terms of you doing the deep work in yourself, because the whole premise of the book is before you can lead your organization through change, you need to go through change first as a leader, okay? And the only way that you're going to do that is by being self-aware. And self-awareness is not so much just about understanding what you're good at. That's helpful, but it's also understanding what are the shadow sides.
Yeah.
What is the shadow to your bright light?
Right.
And so understanding personality, I think, is so enlightening. Like when I took the DISC profile, when people take the Enneagram, when people take all these different things, I think in my case that it is liberating. So if you're in a marriage and your wife complains about you because you're a certain way, but then there's actually like a label or a
Yeah.
description,
Yeah.
it makes you feel a little bit better. Like,
Right.
okay,
Yeah.
I'm strong here, but also describes why I'm not strong in these other areas.
Right.
So I think it's really important not only to double down on the areas of strength, but also to deal with your shadow side as well.
There are people here that are leading small communities, right? We call them life groups. And they're trying to figure out, okay, like I guess an essential thing would be, what is defining success, right? A successful life group leader, we would say that it is someone who is influencing them, discipling them, influencing them to have a personal relationship with Jesus, someone that is living in community. But if someone lacks self-awareness as to how they are wired, they're going to be tempted to emulate and lead their life group like Pastor Josh and Pastor Noemi lead their life group, or how Steve Chaparro leads his life group. Where does having liberty and self-awareness lend itself to you becoming a better leader?
So let's say, for instance, that you have a life group, you have a life group leader, then you have the members of that life group. Okay, so if we're asking how do we help the members of the life group, be self-aware, or even the life group leaders, I think that it is the responsibility of the leaders to model transparency, to model authenticity,
Yeah.
and to help people learn more from your scars than your trophies. That's the way I learn.
Why?
Like I don't care about your trophies. Who cares? Like you're showing me the product of 20 years of like it's an overnight success that took 20 years. Looking at that trophy does me no good because I know how long it took you to get there.
Yeah.
What I want to learn is what are the bumps and bruises and the scars, the injuries, what was the pain that you had to endure? Because for me, passion isn't described like most people describe it. Many people describe passion as the things that bring you pleasure in life. For me, passion is the amount of pain that you are willing to endure to see your goal through.
Right.
So just like Jesus, like I used the story of Thomas. Thomas did not identify with Jesus conquering death, meaning that he was alive. Seeing Jesus alive didn't convince him. What convinced Thomas? The scars in his hands.
Right.
So I feel like that was the connection that he had. So when we're able to demonstrate to people that we are real people going through real journeys, real hardships, and that I know what I'm good at, but I also know what I'm not good at. Let me show you. Like when I speak, even here at church, I think people are more impacted by the struggles that we've been through than me saying, oh, I'm this close to God, or my marriage is this, my business is this. No one cares.
Right.
It's a false sense of security and success.
Right.
So I think it's more about like not literally, but I would rather let people see my scars and say, hey, I know you're struggling. I know you're in pain. I've been in pain too, but guess what? I made it through.
Yeah.
The reason why I have a scar is because I made it through.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and then God gets the glory in that.
Absolutely.
God gets the glory in that because when we're able to show those things, we have that but God moment, right? It's just like, hey, I went through this, but I made it through because of His grace. I made it through because of His benevolence. I made it through because of His love. I made it through because of His peace.
Right.
Steve, like in our like we have a, when you look at the statistics, especially with young people, how depression rates have gone up, anxiety has gone up,
Yeah.
self-esteem has gone down, confidence in oneself has gone down. The power of social media and the fact that everyone is posting their highlights and posting like their accolades and just their marriage and their relationships and the trips and all these kind of things. It's like sometimes you look at these things and you look at people's highlight reels over and over and over again. It creates a culture of like, hey, this is what I have to show. This is what I have to front. And I feel like for a lot of people in the church, we've created that culture as well. Where do you see what dangers do you see in that? A, and B, what are some practical things that we can do to show our scars and like because it's scary to do that,
Yeah.
especially in a culture that doesn't reward you for that.
Right. Well, I think there's two extremes. I think there's one extreme of, you only show the highlight reel, and then there's other people who show nothing but their problems in life.
Sure, yeah,
Oversharing.
yeah,
So I think it definitely causes problems, both extremes, and some people just choose not to be on social media because it's just either one, fake, or two, toxic. And I think there's the danger of both. I mean, the thought that as you were asking that question came up to me was, what would David look like on social media?
David the psalmist.
David the psalmist,
Yeah.
King David. If the book of Psalms was in a sense his Instagram feed,
it would be all over the place.
it'd be all over the place, right? Because even in one psalm, he's complaining, he's crying, tears that basically wet his entire bed because he's just crying and depressed and all this stuff. But like, there's always a shift. There's always a shift, but like it's like, but God, that whole
Yeah,
thing in
yeah.
all the Psalms. And he says, okay, I don't have anybody to my left or to my right. No one will help me. But then I lift my head to the hills from where my help comes from. So I think it's okay to describe the pain and describe but there has to be hope that comes with it. Like
Yeah.
even Dave Ramsey, when I follow Dave Ramsey, whether people agree with him or not,
Yeah.
one of the things he says, I'm going to use language, I'm going to use a tone of voice, I'm going to say things that rattle your cage, and in fact, they're going to tick you off. I want you to get so ticked off about your current situation that you have no choice but to change. But with that message is I want to give you hope. That hope, there is a hope to get out of your financial mess, to get out of your relational mess, or to find hope in the Lord. So I think it's
Right.
both this context of being able to share not only the pain but also the triumph that comes with it.
Yeah. I mean, as we're having this conversation, we can go into a bunch of different directions. And one of the things that I love is that you're family. So we're definitely going to have you here again and again. But as a person who looks at design and looks at the functionality of things, what is a hope? What is an ideal vision? You're a visionary. At its best, what would be the church's function and impact on culture today?
Man, that's a deep question. I don't know if I've thought of that. I think, let's be honest and say that some of the worst testimony for Jesus Christ has been individual Christians,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that's because many times we come off as that highlight reel version of Christianity where we say, this is the ideal, this is the standard that God has set. But what we fail to many times express is that as human beings, we will always fall short. So I think being able to share this message of the gospel that says Jesus is the hope for us, that we will always fall short, whether I'm a pastor, whether I'm an evangelist, whether I'm a host, whether I am someone out in the parking lot, whether I am, leading a life group, that we are a people that are broken, that serve a God that fixes broken people. And I think that authenticity, that transparency, that it's to say, hey, we're not here to show you an ideal, because only He is the ideal. But
Yeah.
we are people on a journey, that we are constantly on this journey of transformation. I'm learning every day, and I want to share with you what I have learned so far. And I think if we come with that posture of, I want to share with you what I have learned so far, there's so many things that come with that. Is one, we're not saying that we know it all. Two, we're saying that we have learned some things that we want to share.
Right.
And we're saying that there are some things that we are open to, some new learnings that we're open to.
Yeah.
Because I think too many times we as Christians want to come off as if, at this snapshot, this moment in time, I know what I need to know for the rest of my life. No. I don't care if you're a televangelist or if you're a theologian, you are constantly going to be learning things from life and from people, even fools. Because even a fool will teach you what not to do.
Hey, man. Steve, coming from, I coming from a family of people who were in vocational ministries, bishops, pastors, did you ever feel that because you, didn't lead one of those churches that you came from, or, they took up a family mantle in the way that your context showed a family mantle, did you ever feel inferior, like you weren't serving God?
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that I have probably struggled with for 25 years. So when I came out of college in 1997, I thought, that God was going to call me to pastor a church, even while being in the marketplace. And I remember that I had these visions. It was as if I was frothing at the mouth with these visions of what God was calling me to do.
Yeah.
And I remember the Lord told me one time in prayer, He said, Steve, if I grant you all of these dreams that you have, these visions, but I put you in the second seat, would you be okay with that? And I'm like, no, like these are my visions. And He's like that old Jewish guy in Coming to America. That's the problem. These are your visions.
Yeah.
These are not my visions. And so I started to see a lot of my peers growing up. My dad's peers in ministry, their children who were my age being given churches or becoming pastors. And I would get frustrated because they're like, Coach, God, let me in.
Yeah, put me in.
I'm like, don't you know who you got here? Like, you've put me together, you've gifted me. And so when I gave that response of like, no, these are my visions, I need to be in the first chair. He says, that's the problem. Sit on the bench. You need some time to learn. You need some time to be coached, to live some life, to go through some battles. And so there are countless examples in Scripture where people were given a vision by the Lord, whether it was Joseph, whether it was David, whether it was Saul, the Apostle Paul. These people God gave them the vision of what their calling was upon life, but they needed to actually go through some stuff and be shaped and reshaped. And, Joseph, man, he was, sold as a slave. He served, the governor, then was put back in jail, then served Pharaoh, like back and forth. And it's like, it's very easy for me to think, that I'm wasting time.
Yeah.
I'm 47, Freddie. I'm 47.
Yeah.
And I have, I've got some of my peers that have been in ministry, like pastors, for 10, 15, 20 years. And I remember that there was one of my mentors, he said, Steve, like, don't compare yourself to other people. He says, what God has done for them in 20, God can do for you in 2
Right.
when it's your time.
Right.
And it's not even to say that I'm ever going to be called to be a traditional pastor,
Right.
because I have always felt that my call to pastor is in the marketplace.
Right.
So it's going to look different.
Different.
The spirit is the same, but the flesh is different. How it operates, how it looks, how it maneuvers, how it ministers is going to be different. So I think too many times we embrace so much the flesh, the outward form of what this looks like, and we don't strip it down to the spirit of, like, what does it mean to be an apostolic gifted person? Like, okay, whether you call yourself even a prophet, like, don't use the word prophet. Like,
Yeah.
that's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But to have a prophetic gifting,
Yeah.
and what does it look like to be able to operate in that way? So those are some lessons. I mean, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I would say that when I write my book and the main target are frustrated visionaries, it's because I feel like I'm one.
Mm.
And when we talk about in that season of the in-between, I'm not at the ending of something. I'm not at the beginning of something. I'm right in between. And for most visionaries, it is so frustrating when you find yourself in that in-between. You have a vision, but you're not there yet. You're stuck in the in-between. And I'll tell you what, the greatest transformation doesn't happen at the end or at the beginning of something. It happens in the in-between. So if people are in the in-between, God has you exactly where he wants you. You're not in the wrong place. You're not in the wrong place. This is where God is shaping you. This is where God is molding you. And like Andy Stanley says in his book, Visioneering, he says, the duration that you are in the waiting period is directly proportional to the task that you are being prepared for.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So if you've been waiting for 20 years, well, you've been baking for 20 years, because what God is cooking is going to be something big.
Right.
So if God doesn't have you in it, almost like be careful if something comes too easy.
Yeah, you don't want no microwave result. You want crock pot sitting in. Hey, kind of want to, I want to go into so many different directions, but I do feel like in this moment, our church, Revive Church, we're in the in-between. I mean, you describe where we are. A couple episodes ago, Pastor Noemi shared how we're on this journey. And I asked her a question. Ideally, in an ideal world, what does the church look like? And she was like, I honestly don't even know, because God knows. But I know that we're in the journey right now. For those of us that are journeying with this community, what would be a word of encouragement that you have for those of us? Because we feel like it's that we're not quite beginning, because we're not a small church. We're not a small community. We've got history. We've got a great core. There's a lot of people that are, hey, we don't even know, and she alluded to that too. We don't even know like what this, but I know that God has called me here, but we're not at the end either. And we actually don't even see like the end of whatever this process is in near sight. So what would be the encouragement that you have for those that are part of this community and maybe part of other communities that are in the in-between?
So I'm going to use a really wild illustration to kind of describe that. So I was in the home building industry, and so we had model homes, right? Model homes fully decked out, painted up, with furniture and everything, and it really looked nice. And people, hey, I would love to have that. Then we would take them into the house that they bought, and it was bare walls, zero furniture, zero paint other than white, and all these different things. And they were like, oh man, like this looks so different. But the way we would sell it to them was, this is a blank canvas. You can make it what you want it to be. And so I think that many cases, what we have done in church is we have been satisfied with a former form. Meaning, like, let's say, for instance, like, I want that model house, the equivalent of that being the church. Like, I want this form of church. I want, this preaching. I want this music. I want this church. And I want it to be designed a certain way. I want to have life groups that cater to me and all these different things, because that is the form that we have benefited from throughout all of these years. I almost feel like God is saying, okay, let's take that model church, put it to the side a bit. Let's look at it as a blank canvas and let's strip it down to what is really the church. Like, let's look at the Bible. What does the Bible describe to us the big screens?
Mm-mm.
Does it describe to us all of these, this band with, 5 guitars and
Mm-mm.
2 drums and 10 singers?
Mm-mm.
It doesn't. Does it describe, the youth groups?
Mm-mm.
It
Rich
doesn't.
programming?
Now, all of
No.
those are good
Yeah.
because those have evolved as forms, mechanisms to deliver church. But I'm almost like saying, if we were to strip things away and just really look at what is the church about? What is community? What is communitas, as Alan Hirsch would say? That it's not even about being told stuff, but it's about facilitating discovery.
Yeah.
So what would it look like? So what is the blank canvas? Couldn't we look at the church as a blank canvas? And so when I even think of it in terms of architecture, in architecture, they taught us in architecture school, don't begin with the end design or the end form already in mind. Because if you do that, you will defraud yourself of anything better. So this is how they told us to approach it. You take a blank piece of paper and you draw what? One line. That line will inspire the next line and inspire the next line. And that journey of discovery, that journey where new ideas start to emerge, new forms, new expressions, new manifestations, new experiences that could have never happened before if you settled on that first initial design. So I am almost saying, like, let's use even this idea of architecture, of taking a blank piece of paper for the church, and what can it become? It's not about what we're losing. Yes, we'll grieve what we're losing
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
there is grief in that, but also what can manifest from this that will be even better than the former. It's like even in scripture where the old elderly folks, they mourned the former temple, but God is trying to do something new.
Yes.
God is trying to do something new. So maybe that's the visionary in me that's talking
Yeah.
about embracing the new and allowing things to emerge versus settling for the former forms.
Right.
But I think there's something beautiful that will happen if we are open-handed, open-minded, and even taking this whole blank canvas approach of what can the church be as opposed to what the church isn't providing for me.
You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to think about. And I think this is one of those, I consume resources and podcasts, and, very seldom do you go back and listen to one again. This is, Steve, going to be one that I'm going to encourage everyone to just listen to over and over, because there are so many deep and rich nuggets in this conversation. And I think these are conversation starters. And so I'm going to do two things before we end this. Number one, I am going to encourage people to listen to this prayerfully. When you re-listen to this and listen to this again, and you feel that God is speaking to you, I want to encourage people to just pause it and say, Lord, what are you trying to say to me? Because we've touched on a plethora. The spectrum here that in this conversation is so wide and is so rich. And I want you to pause this and say, Lord, what are you trying to say to me through this? And number two, I want to encourage people to have this conversation with others. Steve is a dear friend, and Steve, you and I have called each other, we've texted each other, and said, "Hey, can we have some coffee?" And you introduced me to all the great coffee locations here in Long Beach. But something happens. The dynamic of having a one-on-one conversation about these ideas and these visions that we don't even have language for sometimes, we can't
Yeah.
even describe,
Right.
are so inspiring. And I would encourage you guys, call it a Freddie and Steve thing, and contact someone that you can reach out to and have these conversations. Share this podcast with someone, share this episode with someone, and just say, hey, we're going to review this. We're going to talk about this. Steve, is there anything that you'd like to just say and leave our listeners with? Is there something that is in your heart and you're like, you know, we'll further develop this in the next conversation, but is there something that you just feel in your heart that you just want to deposit?
Well, I will just say this: as I was thinking about, several years ago, about, I had a friend that asked me, Steve, what is it that you desire most for others? And I said, I desire that they experience transformation. And then he said, have you found this for yourself? Yeah, that's what it did for me too. It caused me to like, oh, wow. And so the principle of that which I desire most for others is also that which I desire most for myself. And so starting to realize that my purpose in life was helping others find purpose in their life.
Yeah.
And so I just, recommend for people to ask themselves those two questions. What do you desire most for others? And then once you've answered that, ask yourself, have you found it for yourself? And so I have everything to thank for my friend Sam Song, who
Yeah.
asked me those two questions.
Yeah.
And I leave you with that.
Thank you so much for being with us today. We love you dearly. Thank you so much for being with us for this rich conversation. Please leave a rating and a review on wherever you're listening and consuming this podcast. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe. And if you have a question for Steve, leave it in the comment section. And maybe next time we have you on, we can also ask you some listener questions, because I think that that's going to be a fun thing that maybe we do with other guests that we're going to have with us. We are here at Revive Studios in Long Beach. And so we want to thank our team, our creative team, for making this possible. But also want to thank you, because without you, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing. So until next time, go offer hope, ignite hearts, and live in freedom.